Hello, everybody, and welcome to Emmanuel United Church of Christ Online. We are an open and affirming worshiping community right here in St. Bernard, Ohio. If we have not met yet, my name is Jonathan. I am the pastor here at Emmanuel United Church of Christ, and we are all so happy that you are here. So this week I've brought you into my office, and I just did so. I thought this would be a good place to set up this week, just to show you sort of the chaos of my life this week, studying for our scripture to deliver this message to you. And really, the reason for that is if you feel lost, me too. These are all some of my Bible commentaries I've been digging into this week, which I do every week, but I've really needed these this week. Really, the message comes to us from the book of Philemon. And normally I read to you our scripture for the week, but this week I'm just going to ask that you read Philemon on your own. Good news is it's real short. I don't know if you can see from there, but this is it. That's the entire book of Philemon. It's the shortest letter in the Bible. It's, of course, obviously then Paul's shortest letter. Something like 335 words to be exact. But don't let the size of this letter mess with your conceptions that it's not going to be deep, because this letter is incredibly deep, and it is just jammed packed. It's to the point where I've needed just really every inch of time that I've had this week to be able to deliver this message. And this letter, Philemon, is actually very interesting. Before we even get to the depths of what the letter says, it's interesting because this is a letter written from Paul to a person. Philemon is a person, whereas you might read Corinthians or you might read letters to the Hebrews. This is instead a letter not written to a church or a people or a community. It is written to a person named Philemon. So this letter is personal, but it is not really necessarily private, if that makes sense. And the reason it's not private is because Philemon is actually a wealthy person who then is a head of a church. Now, I wouldn't necessarily equate this to a pastor. Philemon just happens to have the wealth to house a church. So the church may be housed in his actual home, but he has the wealth and ability to house a church for Paul, or for the faith, really. So in that, this letter to Philemon is a hope to, yes, reach Philemon, but also to reach Philemon's community through Philemon. And you'll also, and I'm saying Philemon a lot, aren't I? You'll also learn along the way that there are other names in here that Paul includes, so that Philemon is not the only person that actually reads this. But this is an incredibly diplomatic letter, and it is written in order to persuade Philemon, so it is political in nature. And it's kind of funny, you'll notice this now as you read through this letter on your own time. You'll see Paul's mechanisms. You'll see Paul coming in with the sweet and the nice, and slowly he will build his case. He'll build his appeal. I mean, he even goes as far as to say, like, this appeal is made through love and through faith, and I'm just a poor old man. He even says, I'm just a poor man, but I make this appeal to love, trying to get that sympathy vote, right? So Paul is in prison. He's in prison doing the work of Christ, which is a reminder that the early church was highly persecuted. So Paul's in prison, writing to a wealthy church head, making an appeal to Philemon. And what is that appeal? Well, we hear of Onesimus. The person's name is Onesimus, and Onesimus is with Paul in prison. Now, what we learn, and that we can kind of gather, is that Onesimus is actually Philemon's slave. We can gather that Onesimus is probably, most likely, a runaway slave, which is why he's now in prison with Paul. But in their time together, Paul has now converted Onesimus to the Christ-following faith, not yet really coined Christianity yet. And so here's Paul's plea to Philemon. Essentially, Paul is going to ask Philemon to take Onesimus back. Not just to take Onesimus back, but to accept Onesimus back as a brother, as a freed person, which is sort of this huge ask when you think about it. As unfortunate as it is to say, wealthy folks had slaves. That was a part of the life, and I'm not even going to try to pretend to explain it away. It's super problematic. We don't love it. We struggle with those sorts of things, but it is the reality of the time. And so Onesimus, as a runaway slave, deserved legally punishment. And Philemon had every right to see Onesimus, every legal right to see Onesimus punished, right? So the fact that Paul is pleading with Philemon to not just take Onesimus back, but to take Onesimus back as a freed brother, that's an incredibly deep ask, especially for this time and this place. Some might call this an ultimate lesson in grace, because it really is. Now, of course, in the story, you might find that we are always called to be Paul-like in the story. We are always called to seek out justice, to free those which are in bondage. But we're also, of course, often called out for being more Philemon-like, right? Now, when we talk about being Philemon-like, we don't necessarily mean that you literally have to be a slave owner to identify as Philemon, but we are called to understand Philemon as sort of a religious elite, somebody who goes to church every Sunday, who still needs to be called on to do better and to be better. That's something that the church could really hear a message on today, right? And this ultimate call for grace, to be Christ-like, to be a follower of Christ, is so countercultural that it calls on us to give up those things that we believe we have the right to, so that others may live. That's a radical lesson. That's a radical faith that we have in Jesus Christ, but it is a faith that we have in Jesus Christ. And we still have not yet gotten to Onesimus, really, have we yet? To understand Onesimus, the runaway slave. You see, Paul calls Onesimus, this runaway slave, formerly useless. And I gotta tell you, that word really stuck around with me this week. It's haunted me almost. And really, I think the reason why it's haunted me is because when I hear Paul call Onesimus useless, what I hear Paul saying is unqualified, which, if you've been around the church, you know has been a big part of my own downfall, is this feeling, this self-loathing almost, this feeling of feeling unqualified, or as Paul might say, useless. And almost in an ironic turn of events, if not almost an ordained turn of events, we had our Bible study last week, and we were talking about the different translations of Bibles. And so I had all of these Bibles laid out in our education room, all of these different translations. We're kind of going through when and where they were written and gathered. And I had picked up this Bible, actually. And this is the New English Bible, and I had picked it up and I opened the front cover, and in this cover is an inscription, and I realized that this Bible belonged to somebody who's now no longer with us, but somebody who's meant an incredible amount to my ministry and my life, and I only ever met this person once. I'm trying to remember if there was a second time, but it was the smallest meeting, the one time that changed the course of my ministry forever. And this person's name was George Reese. So just to give you some context, my family, we were living in Kentucky at the time, and our pastor needed a Sunday away. I forget if it was a sabbatical or if he was ill, and George Reese came to fill in for our pastor. Now, I've never met George in my life. I have no idea who this person is, and to my surprise, my parents did. And the reason that my parents did is because George Reese was a pastor for a church up in our hometown of Wauseon, Ohio. And I don't know who this person is. My parents do, and there's a lot of energy around this whole Wauseon of it all. And so I talked to George about how I had been feeling the struggle with the call to ministry and feeling unqualified. And of course, again, if you know my story, a big part of that feeling unqualified goes back to when I was a college dropout. I was a CD student in high school only to become a college dropout. And so I was really struggling with that feeling of being unqualified. And George looked at me and he said, "Well, sounds to me like God could really use a college dropout right now." And everything in my life changed. everything. I had signed up for seminary, or I had applied to seminary that week, and really the rest is history. And to add a layer, to add books and whatnot, to understand this through my own journey, maybe I was my own Philemon. And maybe Onesimus was never really useless. He was just being misused. And me, as my own Philemon, was misusing myself. That's why I was useless, was because I was misusing myself. Now, again, we are always called to be the Paul of the story. We are always called to empower others. We are always called to seek justice and to fight oppression, to fight for the freedoms of others. But some of us are the Philemons in the story, and others of us are the Onesimuses. And some of us are both Philemon and Onesimus, and some of us might be in this weird inception time of your life where you are a Paul, you are a Philemon, and you're an Onesimus. That's a Onesimus. You see, some of us are called to empower others, to be like Paul, to lift others up, to be somebody's George Reese. And some of us are in this season in our life where we are Onesimus, and we need to be empowered, and we're really just one George Reese away from really just being activated. Which brings us back to being Paul. Who in your life could you be a George Reese for? Who could you name in your life today that needs somebody just to empower them, just to lift them up? Or maybe you are in that season of your life where you're a Philemon and you need to let go. You need to let go of something to actually give up power. Maybe there's somebody in your life that you need to forgive. Even though you have every right to be mad or angry, you're realizing that in this season of your life, that anger is really just a power over you. And so you actually need to let go of power. And to go even further, and all three of these might be lessons that we can all learn from. To learn to empower others, to be powered ourselves by that which is good and holy, and to depower everything else. To learn to empower others, to learn to be empowered by that which is good, and to depower everything else. So you can see why I've been buried in books and commentaries all week trying to understand this. Who knew that 335 words could mean so much and have such depth and meaning, and yet the letter of Philemon does. To empower others, to allow yourself to be empowered, and to depower that which you should. That's today's lesson.